So many of you guys saw my last video about how to add carbs to the carnivore diet, basically how I do it. I wanted to share with you guys a little bit more of a holistic viewpoint about the subject. I talked to Dr. Paul Saladino, the carnivore M.D. He's also experimenting with adding some carbohydrates into his carnivore diet. And in today's video, we're going to hit this subject up. Towards the end of the video, we also get into a good discussion about the other aspects of healing. It's always about the food and about the gut biome, but it's a holistic approach. If you're going to heal your skin and keep it healed forever, you got to do some other stuff. And we talk about that at the end of the video as well. If you're loving this content, make sure to like it. Remember to share it. Remember to hit the notification bell. Remember to subscribe and share. Much love. For the first probably year, I was pretty strict keto with my carnivore foods. And then just as I love to experiment and I like to see, where you can wiggle and what different things will do. And I've done the same thing, adding some honey and then adding a few of what I call the low risk trigger foods from the plant kingdom that I've previously established for myself as working. And I've seen it changed the way I feel slightly on the carnivore diet, but more so in a way of performance and aesthetics. So for me, both are super easy to maintain. They taste delicious. I never really get bored because the satiation level, and I just think when your body is so filled up with the right nutrients, your cravings kind of cease to exist.
Yeah.
When I was vegan, it was eat a ton of food and always have cravings and always hungry. And that's not the case anymore at all. But what I've noticed with a really fat-based and ketogenic style carnivore diet is it is extremely easy to stay very shredded and very lean while holding on to a good amount of muscle. You really don't lose the muscle at all. Cognitively, hormonally, feels really good, really awesome, really consistent. What the carbs have done for me is it gives me that little extra explosiveness in my workouts. I'm a former athlete, and when I'm on a ketogenic style, there is no lack, but when I add the right amount of carbs for myself from smart sources, the lifts and the workouts have a little extra juice for me personally. Also, I think that if people are kind of in that place where beef and salt only as a dietary intervention for healing is, they can't do it, you'd be really surprised what adding a very small amount of honey to that diet will do to your taste buds. So I've had a similar kind of results and experience that you have with that.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And that's been my experience with carbohydrates too. I don't have objective measures. I don't really lift that heavy. I'll deadlift and squat, but I'm never I'm not like a power lifter. Right. So it's been hard for me to kind of distinguish. I do think perhaps with the carbs, I feel a little better in the gym. I think I probably weigh a few pounds more, which is fascinating, like 2 to 3 pounds, probably muscle glycogen. And I've talked about this in the past. There have been studies with keto adapted athletes. And I mean, I was very keto adapted, suggesting that the amount of muscle glycogen and repletion is equivalent between carbs and no carbs. But I probably gain a few pounds of water weight when I do carbs, suggesting that maybe my glycogen stores are a little higher. That could all just be liver glycogen, because certainly when we eat carbs, we're going to fill up the liver glycogen. When we don't eat carbs, what appears to happen is we still have muscle glycogen, but maybe that's just the liver weighing a few more pounds, which is quite possible from the liver glycogen. But I do think that perhaps there's a little bit of a difference for me with carbs. And like I said, I've got a cookbook coming out in the fall, and I want to offer both versions to people and let them know. And then also expand in the cookbook on the spectrum of plant toxicity. I'd be curious to see what carbs you've used from the plant kingdom, but I do think that plants exist on a spectrum of toxicity, and there probably are some plants that most people can eat. It's not the plants that we think of as traditionally healthy. I sort of joke that I'm like the anti-broccoli crusader, and I was just on another podcast.
I'm on that squad too.
Right? Like I was just on another podcast with a doctor who's all about leafy greens, and I was like, no, we're going to agree to disagree. I think leafy greens are the worst thing to happen to humans. But you and I, we're in the 0.1% of people who believe that. Right. But I do think that perhaps for some people, things like squash, I'm fascinated by the non-sweet fruits, things like squash, avocado, maybe berries. I think those could be good sources of carbohydrates for people. I even think something like a purple potato could possibly be. I think when we get into the tubers, there's probably a few more things that could be issues for people. Personally, what I found was that honey is the best for me right now. I tried squash and my eczema came back.
Hmm.
And, I was like, huh, that's interesting. I would be surprised. People have talked about lectins in squash. Perhaps that's it. It just doesn't agree with me. But I want people to know that you can incorporate carbohydrates in your diet without having any plant products. Honey is kind of this magical thing,
Right.
totally ancestral. But if you want to have some plant products, and I love that you highlighted this, I think for people who find a carnivore diet or a strict carnivore diet limiting, even having a small amount of plant products can be the difference. For most people I talk to, they're like, I don't think I could eat all meat. And I say, what if you could eat meat and berries and avocado and squash? They say, I think I could do that. I think a lot of people already do a diet or pretty close to that. They're just trying to eat broccoli in addition because they think it's beneficial. So for me, that might be the sweet spot. That's kind of what I consider to be a tier 1 carnivore diet in the book, or a carnivore-ish diet. And I think
Yeah.
that's, you're animal based and you're thinking about which plant foods are the least toxic.
Yeah, totally. I think for me, through my experimentation so far, what actually works really good is squash does seem to work really good for me. I don't eat it in large amounts at all. It's pretty minimal when I do eat it. The other plant foods that work for me are the low glycemic fruits. Simple, basic stuff like some berries, like some pears. Those seem to be totally fine for me. When I work exclusively with the eczema, dermatitis, psoriasis community, and I have found there to be some truths to that can kind of ring true for everyone, but also there is a pretty huge individualization within eating food for people like us. And what I found, like, for you, the squash that made your eczema come back. For me, I can get away with some squash. I can even get away with some regular potatoes. But I also think that really the whole journey is about being honest with yourself and your results, and not being too afraid to try something out. If it doesn't work, that's okay. Don't eat it. Try something else. I love how in your new book you're going to kind of give a nice variety of carnivore-ish style eating, and I think that food is the most amazing intervention for people who suffer from skin disease, bar none. But it's
Huge.
not the whole game. It's not everything. There are other aspects to healing and being healthy that are out there. And I've seen, a lot of your videos and your Instagram, and I know that you are someone who moves your body a lot. I know you get out in the sun. I also know that you address the nervous system directly with things like breath work, meditation, and cold exposure. And I'd love to hear about some of the other facets of how you stay on your game in a holistic way.
Yeah. So you think about this all, and I kind of talk about this at the end of the carnivore code. So in my first book, I do offer a spectrum of plant toxicity. I want people to know that. And in the cookbook, I'm going to expand on that quite a bit. And at the end of the carnivore code, which is my first book, I talk about this idea that it's an ancestral way of living. We're really that's what everybody's trying to do, or a lot of people are trying to do, whether you're in the paleo community or whatever. We're trying to say, like, how do we live in a way that's most consistent with our ancestors? And that goes way beyond food. So thank you for this question. And I think it's the next thing is sun. And I'm such a big proponent of real sunlight rather than processed sunlight in the form of a vitamin D pill. I cannot be convinced that those are equivalent. And many people will say, well, I live in Nebraska, like where you're at right now, or
Mm-hmm.
I live somewhere where there's no sun. And I think, like, well, there's other ways to get sun. But for those of us who have access to the sun, at least in the summer, we should be in it, and we should not fear the damage, or we should not fear that the sun will do damage to our skin. Certainly if we are fair skinned, that means we are efficient sun harvesters, and we may need to use sunscreen if we're out at a lower latitude for longer amounts of time. But be careful with the type of sunscreen you're using, because some of them are going to have plenty of xenoestrogens in them. So I'm Mediterranean. When I go out in the sun, I don't need sunscreen at like this latitude of San Diego. If I go to Hawaii, I'm probably going to need some sunscreen unless I have a really good base tan. And there are plenty of sunscreens that are zinc based that don't have these bad additives. but all of us will probably need sunscreen if we go like really equatorial in the summer. I think that there's so much of a fascinating conversation around this with how the fatty acid composition of our cell membranes affects the way that our skin reacts to the sun. I think anyone in the eczema, psoriasis, dermatitis community is going to be aware of this too. You hear people say this, and it's only really started to kind of coalesce for me. On ketogenic and carnivore diets, people will anecdotally note that they get burned less often. And I think it's probably because we're eating less vegetable oils. And I think that these polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which are already oxidized or susceptible to oxidation, are the main problem with skin issues, skin cancers, and burning of the skin. When we eat more saturated fat, which I strongly believe is healthy for all humans, we're still going to eat some monounsaturated fat and a very small amount of PUFA, polyunsaturated fat. But this ratio between poly, mono, and saturated, I think, is something that we all have to get right to get adequate skin health in the sun. Super important. And I think that so much of what we might be seeing regarding the incidence of skin cancers in people in the sun, specifically squamous and basal, is related to overconsumption of vegetable oils at large by our population, which is something that we all know happens widely. Interestingly enough, melanoma incidence is lower in people who have chronic low-level sun exposure, and melanoma is really not felt to be an exclusively sun-based cancer. Squamous and basal, yes, and I think that that is more of the vegetable oil thing, but melanoma is the one most people worry about. They're all concerning, but I think it's a big problem with the oils in our diet and how they react. So I encourage people to get out into real sun, not processed sunlight like a vitamin D pill, because there are other things. Just like there are parts of the organs that we don't really even know about that are probably beneficial for us, I think there are many things that happen when we are in the sun that are so beneficial that we can't even be aware of now. We know that there's endorphins, there's all kinds of things that happen in the skin, there's nitric oxide in the sun. We don't get that from taking a vitamin D pill. So real sunlight, no substitute for that, in my opinion, both for circadian rhythm and for all these other good things in our human body, way beyond vitamin D. And then, of course, movement. We know we need to move. I think grounding feels good for everyone. A lot of us can't even touch the earth anymore, but it feels you have to do that. And then cold exposure and heat. These are environmental hormetics. I talk about the difference between molecular hormesis and environmental hormesis in my book, which is a nuanced discussion. But I think the environmental hormetics, sauna, cold, are very valuable for all humans, as is community and doing something we love. So there's so much of the equation outside of food which we need, right? We have to do something we love. We have to be with people we care about. We have to be outside and be moving. Well, in 2020, those are like foreign concepts to us, right? Both because of coronavirus and because of many other things. But I think that there's so much of a discussion here that needs to be had. I mean, evolutionarily, those would have been the things that were the foundation of our life. We would have lived outside. We would have touched the earth all the time. We would have been moving when we hunted. We would have been cold. We would have been warm, and we would have been in the sun. And now we've just become, as Chris Ryan would say, civilized to death in many ways. So